This young man from a small town in Oregon was accused of stealing $1 million in 1996, but 2 years later, he received a letter from his dad that would change the whole story. Sit back and enjoy this story as it unfolds. 1996, in a quiet town tucked deep inside Oregon, the morning peace shattered beneath the wail of police sirens. Doors swung open, curtains lifted. Neighbors stepped onto their porches as officers marched toward a small, weather-beaten room behind a mansion. And in the middle of it all stood Evan Miller, 24 years old, trembling as cold metal cuffs locked around his wrists. People whispered his name like it didn't belong to him anymore. Evan, who worked as a janitor in the wealthiest house in town, but still greeted everyone like an equal. A young man who had no enemies, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. So why were the police dragging him out like a dangerous criminal? They had just found a silver suitcase containing $1 million belonging to his rich employer in his tiny room that left wide open for all to see. After officers rummaged through his belongings, they tipped over his old dresser, scattered his worn-out clothes, opened every box and drawer. Then an officer shouted after finding it, "Here, bring the camera, we found something." They carried out a heavy silver suitcase and placed it on the hood of a police car. The latches snapped open, and neighbors gasped as stacks of crisp $100 bills rose like bricks of sin beneath the morning sun. $1 million. Enough to bury a man. The officers turned to Evan for a reaction, expecting guilt, panic, or confession. But Evan only shook his head slowly, as if he himself couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I've never seen that before," he whispered, voice cracking. That's not mine." But disbelief spread across the crowd like wildfire. To them, the evidence was too clear, too heavy, too damning. A janitor from a poor home. A suitcase overflowing with wealth. An officer pushed his head down as they led him toward the patrol car. His eyes darted desperately from face to face, as if searching for someone, anyone, who might understand. But all he found were stunned stares and murmured suspicions. And just like that, with flashing lights reflecting off his pale, confused face, Evan Miller's life collapsed. Not because of a crime he committed, but because of one choice he refused to make. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Long before the police sirens echoed through the quiet Oregon neighborhood, Evan Miller had lived a simple, disciplined life inside the largest mansion in town. He swept the marble floors before sunrise, polished the railings until they shone like silver, and kept to himself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the value of hard work. The wealthy homeowner barely noticed him, but the man's third daughter, Clara, noticed everything. Clara was 22, beautiful, entitled, and bored with her perfect life. She had grown up getting whatever she wanted: clothes, cars, vacations, even people. So when she saw Evan working silently in the hallway one afternoon, sweat on his brow, eyes focused on the floor instead of her, she felt something unusual: curiosity. She started small. A smile here, a compliment there. Sometimes she brought him cold lemonade, insisting he drink it while she watched. "You work too hard, Evan," she'd say, brushing her hair back with exaggerated grace. "You should come to my birthday party tonight. It'll be fun." But Evan would simply lift the bucket or broom and reply with the same gentle firmness every time. "Thank you, Miss Clara, but I have work to finish." Polite, respectful, uninterested. And that, more than anything, bruised her pride. Her admiration soured into humiliation. Humiliation spiraled into anger. Anger hardened into obsession. Why would a poor janitor refuse her? Who did he think he was? Days passed, and her frustration grew into something darker. She watched him from windows, followed him down hallways, studied his every movement. And then, one late evening when the house was quiet, A wicked idea blossomed in her mind, an idea so sharp and poisonous that even she hesitated before embracing it. Clara slipped out of her bedroom, sneaked into her father's room. Inside the room sat a black suitcase containing $1 million meant for a business transaction the next morning. She took it. Every dollar. Every bundle. With the suitcase hugged to her chest, she tiptoed across the backyard, heading straight to Evan's small room tucked behind the garage. The moon lit her path like a spotlight. She entered silently and placed the heavy suitcase inside his old metal toolbox, the one he kept under his bed. She pushed it deep enough that anyone opening the box would think Evan had intended to hide it there. Clara paused by the doorway, her smile cold and victorious. "If I can't have you," she whispered, "then no one will." The next day, her father made call to the authorities. By noon, police officers stormed into his room. By evening, the suitcase was found. And by nightfall, Evan Miller, innocent, hardworking, loyal, was dragged away in handcuffs, framed by a woman whose heart had twisted into a weapon. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and quiet despair as Evan Miller stood between two officers, wrists bound, eyes hollow. His father, Ray Miller, sat in the front row, gripping his cap so tightly his knuckles turned white. They had come with nothing but truth, and in places like this, truth often weighed less than money. When the judge asked if Evan had legal representation, Ray rose shakily to his feet. "No, Your Honor," he said, voice trembling. We can't afford one." It was the shame of his life. Ray had spent every dollar he and Evan had saved to rent a single acre of land, the first piece of soil he'd touched since selling his own farm years earlier. He had sold everything back then, even the land his father left him, just to pay for cancer treatments for his wife. She died anyway, leaving him with nothing but grief and a son who worked himself to the bone to provide for them. And now the same son stood accused of stealing $1 million. Evan tried to defend himself, explaining how the suitcase wasn't his, how he had never touched that kind of money, how he had only ever worked, lived, and breathed honesty. But without a lawyer, his words scattered like dust in the wind. Clara's well-rehearsed testimony cut through his pleas. The jury barely needed time to deliberate. 7 years in state prison, the judge declared. The gavel struck like a blow to the heart. As officers took Evan by the arms, he turned back toward Ray, the only family he had left. Their eyes met across the room. Two broken souls tied together by injustice. "Dad," Evan whispered, but the rest of the words were swallowed in his throat. Ray stepped forward, reaching out as if he could pull his son back from the nightmare. Then his legs buckled. He collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, while Evan was dragged through the courtroom doors and out of sight. It was the day the world proved how cruel it could be, and the day a father's heart cracked open. 2 years crawled by like a long winter that refused to thaw. Inside prison walls, Evan Miller learned to live with cold stares, metal bars, and the constant thud of boots echoing down concrete corridors. He kept to himself, working in the laundry room, eating quietly, avoiding trouble. Unlike many inmates, he carried no anger, only a silent grief that pressed on him heavier than the chains around his ankles. Every night he lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how his father was surviving. Ray had always been strong, always the man who worked until his hands bled. But age does what time commands. Evan feared it was finally winning. Outside, Ray Miller pushed himself beyond his limits. The acre of land his son had rented for him was meant to restore his dignity, to give him a reason to rise each day. But his body no longer obeyed him as it once did. His back ached constantly. His breath came in short bursts. Some mornings he couldn't even lift the plow. Yet he kept trying, because giving up felt like betraying his son. Neighbors saw him limping across the field, leaning on tools that should have supported crops, not him. Bills he once paid with ease now piled like fallen leaves at his door. Machinery rusted. The well pump broke, and on a day when the wind cut through him like a blade, Ray collapsed at the edge of the field. That night, with trembling hands and blurred vision, he sat at the small table by the window and wrote to Evan. He didn't mention the pain in his chest or the dizzy spells that frightened him. He didn't confess how often he fell asleep hungry. Instead, he wrote what mattered most. My dear son, the planting season has come, and I find myself too old and too sick to plow the field alone. I had hoped to make you proud, but my strength is failing. God willing, we shall meet again. Ray signed the letter with a shaking hand, sealing his sorrow inside the envelope, and prayed his boy would forgive him. Evan sat on the edge of his narrow prison bunk, the thin mattress dipping beneath his weight as he unfolded his father's letter for the 5th time. The paper trembled in his hands, not from the cold, but from the fear clawing at his chest. Each sentence felt like a bruise on his heart. Ray wasn't just struggling, he was fatting. The acre of land Evan had sacrificed everything for was slipping out of his father's grasp. He closed his eyes. If the land went to waste, their dream died with it. If Ray pushed himself any harder, he might die with it. A heaviness settled inside Evan, the kind that could crush a man if he let it. But instead of breaking, something sharp and determined rose within him. He had no money, no influence, no freedom. But he still had his mind. He still had one move left. He grabbed a pencil that had been chewed down to half its size and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He didn't write about love or worry or the pain of missing home. He wrote a single, strategic message, one that would not fail to get the attention of the people who watched him more closely than his own father could. He wrote, "Dear Dad, please don't dig in the field for now. That's where I buried all the money I stole. Wait until I'm released." He didn't need to explain anything else. He didn't dare. He folded the letter carefully, sealing it with the weight of his plan, a plan born not out of deceit, but out of desperation to save his father's life. When he handed it to the guard, their expression did not change, but Evan knew. Every letter from a prisoner was opened, inspected, read. Nothing traveled untouched. In the mailroom, the local prison authority skimmed the lines, and Evan's bait caught immediately. The letter never made it to Ray. They didn't even bother forwarding it. They tucked it aside, whispering to each other, eyes narrowing with suspicion and anticipation. And for the first time since being locked behind concrete walls, Evan felt a spark of hope, not for his freedom, but for the help his father desperately needed, help he could never offer with his own hands. By sunrise, Ray knew something was wrong. The distant growl of engines rolled across the farmland like an approaching storm. When he stepped out to the porch, his breath caught. 4 police trucks, followed by 2 plowing machines and a line of hired laborers, were rumbling straight toward his fields. Before he could even speak, the officers were out barking orders, waving documents he wasn't allowed to read. The laborers were pushed forward, shovels hitting the earth in sharp, relentless rhythm. The machines roared to life, carving into the soil as if searching for the bones of the earth itself. Neighbors gathered at the fence line, whispering. Rumors flew faster than the dust rising from the torn ground. Did they find something? Is Ray hiding stolen money? Why so many officers? Within an hour, reporters arrived, cameras clicking, microphones pushed toward Ray's stunned face. But Ray had no answers. He only stood there helplessly, watching decades of harvest soil being shredded under metal teeth. He begged them to stop, begged for someone to explain, but the officers didn't listen. They dug as if the truth was guaranteed to be buried somewhere under his land. By sunset, every inch of the field had been ripped open, overturned, exposed, and they had found nothing. The officers packed up without a word, leaving deep scars in the earth and deeper ones in Ray's spirit. As the last truck rolled away, Ray's knees buckled. He dropped into the ravaged soil, hands trembling, mind racing with fear. What had his son written? What had they believed? And why did he feel like his whole world was collapsing beneath him? Several days passed before Ray gathered the courage to visit the prison. The field behind his farmhouse looked like a battlefield, trenches cut open, soil piled in rough ridges, the quiet scars of a humiliation he still didn't understand. With heavy steps and a heavier heart, he made the long journey to see his son. In the visiting room, Ray sat across from Evan, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Son, I sent a letter. I never got your reply." Evan's expression softened with a faint, knowing smile. "Dad, I hope you enjoyed the help I sent. You can go ahead and plant your maize now." Ray blinked, confused for a moment. Then the truth hit him like a morning sun breaking through fog. Evan hadn't sent money. He'd sent manpower. The police and laborers who tore up his field. They had unknowingly done the job Ray could never afford. The entire land had been plowed for free. Ray walked home that night with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The very act meant to investigate him had prepared his farm better than any hired worker ever could. So he planted. Row after row of maize seeds slipped into the freshly overturned soil. Then, as if nature itself had been waiting, the rain came exactly when it was needed. Gentle, steady, blessing every seed with perfect timing. Weeks passed, and Ray watched his land transform, lush, green, abundant. By harvest season, the yield was unlike anything he had ever seen. He earned more from that single harvest than from all his previous years combined. One crisp morning, Ray walked into a lawyer's office, clutching a bag filled with just a little part of the abundant earnings of his miraculous harvest, ready to fight for his son's freedom. The lawyer Ray hired was not a man easily intimidated. Calm, sharp, and relentless, he listened to Ray's trembling recount of the case, then nodded once firmly. "We're reopening everything," he said. "Your son will not rot in prison for a crime he didn't commit." The appeal process began like the first tremor before an earthquake. Files were pulled from dusty cabinets, witnesses were re-summoned, and for the first time, people began to whisper that perhaps the truth had been twisted. Then came the first breakthrough. The lawyer uncovered missing security footage, a piece of evidence mysteriously omitted during the original trial. The grainy midnight recording showed Clara sneaking into the small room behind the garage. She wasn't delivering anything. She wasn't checking on anyone. She was placing something inside Evan's old toolbox. It was enough to crack the case open. Then a second revelation surfaced. Clara's closest friend, shaking pale, overwhelmed by guilt, confessed that Clara had bragged about teaching Evan a lesson after he rejected her. She had laughed, the friend said, about how easy it would be to ruin him. Piece by piece, the story she had woven began to shred. When Clara was invited to the station for questioning, the interrogation room felt electric. Her excuses collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Her arrogance drained into panic. Her voice cracked, and then she broke into sobs. Cornered, exposed, with nowhere left to run, Clara finally whispered the words that shattered the lie she created. "I framed him. It was me. I loved him, but he never gave me the attention I needed. He turned me down instead, and I had promised myself no one else will have him if I can't have him." The courtroom was silent, every chair filled, every eye fixed on the judge as he prepared to deliver the verdict. 2 years of uncertainty, fear, and heartbreak had brought Evan Miller back to this moment, a young man who had endured injustice, prison, and false accusations, finally standing on the brink of freedom. "Evan Miller," the judge said, voice steady, "after reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and newly presented facts, this court declares you innocent of all charges." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Relief, disbelief, and vindication mingled in the air, but the judge was not finished. "The court orders Mr. Whitman, the father of Clara Whitman, to compensate Mr. Miller the sum of $500,000 for the undue hardship caused. Furthermore, Clara Whitman is hereby sentenced to 6 months in prison for false accusation and obstruction of justice. Evan could barely breathe. His body trembled, knees weak. The chains of accusation and despair, the weight of years stolen from him, lifted in a single moment. He was free. Outside the courthouse, a gray morning turned golden with sunlight as Ray Miller stood among the crowd, leaning on his cane, eyes scanning every face. And then there he was, his son, stepping through the courthouse doors, walking toward him with cautious but unstoppable determination. Ray dropped the cane, and in an instant, 2 years of anguish melted away. They ran toward each other, arms locking, hearts pounding. Tears streamed down Ray's weathered face. Evan pressed his father to his chest, finally feeling the warmth and safety of home. For the first time in 2 long years, they embraced, not as accused and victim, not as father and son separated by injustice, but as 2 souls reunited, bound by love, resilience, and the triumph of truth. Freedom was only the beginning. Evan Miller stepped into the world with cautious hope, the weight of years behind bars still pressing on his shoulders. But now, he had the chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. He returned to his father's farm, repaired the fields, and nurtured the land that had kept their dreams alive. Every seed he planted felt like a promise to himself, to his father, and to the future. A year later, Evan found love and married a kind-hearted woman who embraced him and his past with open arms. The couple's laughter filled their new home. Ray, now frail but radiant with pride, moved in with them. He wandered through the home slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the garden, as if confirming that reality could be this gentle, this good. The joy multiplied when the couple welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, into their lives. Ray's hands, trembling with age, held the small, warm bodies, and tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. He whispered stories of resilience, love, and justice, hoping the children would grow knowing the courage it took to endure hardship and still fight for what is right. 3 years after Evan's release, Ray passed away peacefully in his sleep. But he left this world with a heart full of satisfaction and joy, knowing his son was free, loved, and secure. Evan, his wife, and the twins stood quietly around his bed, feeling the depth of the man's life, sacrifice, and unwavering hope. Ray's last moments had been spent in contentment. He had seen his son exonerated, compensated, and thriving. He had seen grandchildren in his arms. And as his spirit slipped away, he left behind a legacy of resilience, love, and the quiet certainty that truth and justice, however delayed, would always prevail.